Dina, I want to thank you for being willing to share your story with us today. And so, we're going to provide just kind of an overview of your story and your journey so other people can learn from that experience. As we know, storytelling is helpful in shifting narratives and providing an accurate look of what it's like to be an immigrant and the value that's added to our central Indiana community. So, Dina, what was life like before you had to leave home?
hmm So I will start out by saying, it's been many years, more than a third of a century since my family came to the US. I was a teenager, so memories are a little bit distant. I grew up in Russia behind the Iron Curtain, and we were at the beginning of the Jewish Russian wave of immigration that occurred in the early 90s. Specifically, and if I am allowed, I'll share the story of kind of how it happened for us. So, we my mom, my dad, my youngest sister, and then my grandparents came coincidentally on July 4th, 1991. I always cry when I say that because it's probably one of the most meaningful American holidays for our family. Um, Before we came, so we're talking about the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall coming down. And there was a significant movement among Jewish population in Russia and the former Soviet republics of trying to get out because anti-Semitism was always front and center in that part of the world, and it was getting quite heated up again. And so my family was looking at various opportunities for exit. Exit was very hard to obtain for my family in particular because my grandfather was a scientist, and so it was very clear that we would not be allowed to leave just by the virtue of how the system worked. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of some of the cracks began to appear. And specifically in the summer of 1990, there was some legislation ongoing in the US which allowed people to apply for exit visas in Moscow, as opposed to traveling like the road previously traveled through Italy and Austria and all of that. So my very timid dad took who's a scientist, a mathematician, not kind of fight your place in the line kind of person, took a train to Moscow and stood in front of the embassy for 3 days in place in line with number written out in his hand. And they fought mafia and they fought to stay in that line so that he could apply for a right to come to the United States as a Jewish immigrant, as a refugee. And he was successful at that. It is really hard to visualize a timid mathematician standing in line for 3 days, but try to do that. That is not like he fought hard for that. And I'm so grateful to him that he did. He came back and we sat and we waited and we waited and we waited. And the world around us was pretty much crumbling. Like people were trying to get out any which way that they could under any real and false pretenses imaginable. We were very lucky that he got there so early as he did. And we finally received an invitation to come to the American embassy, and we did that. And we interviewed, and then we waited a little bit more. And then my parents, I remember this vividly. I was like 16 at the time, right? They're sitting in the kitchen, and they are calling Immigration Naturalization Services. And every minute of that call was probably like a day's worth of living expenses. And so they waited and they waited, and they had a number on the line like, please hold, your number is 20, your number is 19. They had some elementary English to communicate with INS, and they had this huge map of the America laid out on the kitchen table. And then they were told, yes, your application has been approved, and you're going to a place we've never known, Jacksonville, Florida. Who could have thought, right? And I remember like sitting behind the kitchen door and kind of listening and not really understanding a lot. Luckily, in the way of Jewish degrees of connection, like it only took 2 or 3 families to figure out that somebody just left for Jacksonville, Florida. So at least we knew one family there. And then it took the next 3-4 months to actually purchase tickets. And my dad had to like buy roses and court some person at the Aeroflot, which is the Russian airline, to actually get us 7 tickets. Like it was a lot of tickets to find all at once on one flight. And it happens to be that it was July 4th. So that's how it ended up being July 4th. So in a moment's notice, we transformed from living in St. Petersburg, like average temperature in the summer, maybe 10 degrees, like still wearing our warm clothes. And then in the next 24 hours, through a couple of stops along the way, landing in Jacksonville, Florida, where it was 104 and asphalt was like melting underneath our feet. So that's the journey. Gosh, okay, long day today.
Yeah.
That's our
Thank
journey.
you.
Um,
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a powerful story of what it meant for your family and the difficulties in that process and the waiting and the patience and um, trying to navigate that. So, when you think, I mean, you referenced the temperature, of course, that's a very initial shocking thing when you come to Jacksonville. Um, what was the hardest thing for you or your family starting over in the US?
um, a number of things there, right? I mentioned my grandfather was a scientist and a professor. He had to make a really hard decision to come along. Like he probably could have stayed and worked for a few more years and retired and taken his chances. But being a very tight knit family, it wasn't ever a question. We were either all staying together or we were all going together. So together we came. I think for him, like this loss of his livelihood day to day, his students, which fast forward many years with onset of internet, like he reconnected with so many of his students and stayed in touch for years. Um, I think the stakes for my grandmothers were retired by then. For my mom and dad, an engineer and a professor as well. Um, like finding new jobs in the US, even with the basics of English, was nearly impossible. I think one thing stands out for my mom. She had to take her PhD off her resume because she was told that while she was a good candidate, nobody would ever hire a woman with a PhD because she stood out too much. So she took out her PhD and swallowed her pride and became an engineer. For my dad, his math is everything to him besides his family. We were very lucky that we were supported by the Jewish community in Jacksonville, Florida. One of those members, was a local professor, math professor in the university, really just took my dad under his wing and helped him work through the application process. This is again before the internet. And I remember he copied and printed and copied like over 200 resumes and mailed them out. And then he did that again. And then he did that again until he was able to find a position that would take him. And my parents subsequently moved to Tennessee, and he's a full professor there now, and he's still working and will never lay down his arms, knock on wood. Um, for me as a teenager, a very different story, right? I left my high school love behind. That was the most important thing to me at the time, right? But also, in full honesty, I was the person that kind of moved my family because at the time, early 90s, I seeing all my friends and their families being on the move. Like I guess in a way give an ultimatum or a strong suggestion to my parents saying, hey, like this is what we should be doing because there's a better world where we don't have to worry about, the anti-Semitism and our ability to pursue our goals and our dreams. And I think that's what ultimately moved them. Um, but the sweetheart story aside, my goal was to go to college, right? That I went to a math high school with a lot of emphasis on math and science. I was very young. I was 16, just turned 17 when we came. I was way too young to be going to college. So I actually initially went back to high school. Nobody quite knew what to do with me there. But I was lucky in that I got some good advice from our rabbi who said, hey, you really can apply if you have a high school diploma. And a lot of community support that really, really mattered at the time helped, facilitate the college applications. And I was so blessed and so lucky and everything like 10 times over that Brandeis not just took me in mid-year, but offered me pretty much a full scholarship. And I came to Boston 6 months after we moved to the US and never looked back.
I think you've referenced some things that have been helpful. You had your family, you had your Jewish community that helped support you. Was there any other supports that you received or your family received when you came here that you think really helped you transition to the US?
Yeah, I think a couple important things there. There was a very small immigrant community at the beginning. We were maybe the fourth family in Jacksonville, Florida. So it was very new to not just us as immigrants, but to the Jewish community in Jacksonville. And they were trying to figure out how to help us, what to do with us. Like this didn't go to high school, this didn't go to college, right? So information is gold, and there wasn't a lot of it to go around. There were families whose names, unfortunately, I don't remember anymore, that just took it upon themselves to help us get to appointments, help us with food supply, help us with clothing. There was this kind woman, I think she was a homemaker. Her husband worked at, I think it wasn't Haston Hebrew Academy, but analogous school in Jacksonville. And she just like did a fundraiser, but not in dollars. She collected clothes, she collected school supplies, and they just kept bringing it to our doorstep. And that was just such a wonderful help received, even though we didn't necessarily need all the clothes, but we spread it around the community. It's the information, the lack of information for new immigrants, the lack of English. There are families that took it upon themselves to just volunteer their time and teach us English for years. For years, we've stayed in touch, like my grandparents especially, stayed in touch with those people who would just come to the house, have tea, attempt to speak, learn Russian in exchange for learning English, for us learning English, but really it was their way of giving that to us. There was another really important aspect. My grandma, when she came, she had really awful hips. And within maybe 2 months, she had surgery on her hip and she was walking again. And that medical care that she received was second to none, nothing compared to what we could have ever dreamed of back in Russia. And to fast forward, I think over the years, and we'll come to it, I'm sure, at the end of this discussion, but over the years, we've tried as a family to give back where we can. We can never give back because those people, we've lost touch, but there's a way to give forward, and I'll touch upon that towards the end.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. So it sounds like just community, both community within the refugees who are also settling there, but also the broader community of Jacksonville coming alongside you, which we hear
Yes.
a lot from people who are making that transition. So when we talk about these journeys, sometimes we focus on purely the challenges. I'd love to hear from your perspective what you're most proud of, given the journey that you've been on over the past 20, 25 years.
34 years.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that's good. So I think there's an arc to this, is that we've grown as a family, right? I've gotten married. I have 3 kids. My sister has grown up and gotten married. She has 3 kids, so we've grown. And I think we've given back to the US in mass. So I mentioned my grandfather. I'll start with that just because he was the oldest. Um, he has over 300 students that live both in the US and in Israel and in Australia that have contributed so much to the economies of those countries. And he was a shipbuilding professor. Over 100 of these students alone, and here in the US, and they've all worked and they contributed to the society. So that like, he is the root of that. For my dad, who is a professor, he has had hundreds and hundreds of students in his 33-year career as a professor in the US at all levels. I think the ripple effect is just immeasurable. My mom, who's now retired, worked as an engineer and built both schools and power stations in both Florida and in Tennessee. So that impact is quite significant in the community as well. For myself, I've worked at Lilly for now nearly a quarter of a century. I'd love to think that I've impacted the lives of many, many patients that have better outlook on their health and their long-term perspectives, and their long-term prospects because of the work that I have done. And then as well as for my sister, who's worked in the banking industry. Now she's a stay-at-home mom, bringing up those beautiful kids. I think importantly too, I looked at the generation of kids that have been born here, so 6 altogether between my sister and I, and I'm looking forward to them making a huge impact on the society, on the American economy. We have, some all the way from like somebody who just started school for the first time last week on my sister's side, all the way to, my older kids. My daughter's starting law school in a couple of weeks. I think all of them will have tremendous positive contributions on our society.
I think your family story touches on a number of addressing the misconceptions. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there about who an immigrant is or a refugee and impact. So what would you say is the biggest misconception about immigrants and refugees, and what would you want people to know
Mhm.
when they think about immigrants in our community?
Yeah. Um, I think even especially today, there is a misconception of an immigrant as somebody who leeches on the US economy, consumes the funds, and never pays back. Or the prospect of paying back is so remote, it does not matter that they consume healthcare funds, that they consume food stamps and or SNAP as we call it today. You know, we consumed healthcare funds, we consumed food stamps, we consumed all sorts of help at the beginning. But a lot of what we were given at the beginning, my parents have paid back. Like, for example, tickets from New York to Jacksonville, we had to pay back for each and every one of them to HIAS. And they did so when they gained employment. And of course, while there is no way to, pay back the SNAPs or any other help that we got financially at the time, the long-term contribution of my family is immense. And I can never pay back to Brandeis for the generosity they have offered me, but I certainly hope that I can sometime pay forward to the next generation of students that goes there. It is not going to be true for every immigrant, and I'm sure there are going to be those that are not able to pay back, like my grandparents, for example, right? But we as a family were able to more than return the favors. I think that's the fundamental misconception of an immigrant is somebody who takes but does not give is entirely wrong. And we have so many wonderful stories, even here in central Indiana, with rather large Russian Jewish community here that have contributed in so many spaces and built businesses and created something new and does research. A few of them, I work with side by side at Lilly. They're amazing researchers that have contributed to generating new medicines in the marketplace. That's immeasurable time and again.
I think that leads into, I have a couple last questions. What is an action that someone who's listening to you and your family's story, what is an action step that you would like them or encourage them to take?
Yep. Can I do a quick lead into that with
Yeah.
the kind of the paying it forward part of the story? So I think we all know about the horrible war that Putin unleashed on Ukraine a few years ago. And as U.S. opened up the way for Ukrainian refugees to come to the U.S., 2 years ago now, we took in a Ukrainian refugee family that lived with us for about a year, and we're still very close and support them in every step of the way. They have since had a wonderful baby and will hopefully one day become naturalized immigrants like myself and my family. And so, how did we help them? Like, not everybody can open up their home and actually have somebody entirely foreign to them live with them for a year, right? But there are still ways that everybody can contribute. Um, Most importantly, it's English. If you come into the country and you don't speak the language, it is a dead end. The best you can ever hope for is maybe get a minimal wage job without any prospects of growth. English classes are so hard to come by in the area, and specifically, even the program today that they were a part of is no longer functional because the funding has been cut. So Tatiana, in particular, was taking English classes in the evening, and a month ago got a notification that those classes are no longer available. That is horrible because without, as a new mom, without any English, what's her prospects? Not really bright. So that's number one. Number two, even with Medicaid, access to healthcare is so difficult. So she was pregnant. We had to navigate, and thank God, like I have friends that are in healthcare and could help us. But she had to navigate so much to get to the right level of prenatal care, to have a baby in a healthy setting in a hospital. We're very lucky with her OB, who's also from an immigrant community, helping her through that. To the baby who was subsequently in NICU in dealing with this tremendous bills that were just erroneously not covered because something in one healthcare system didn't connect with something else. Like hours and hours and hours of help that we were able to give them as well as our friends. It's getting from place A to place B, it's preparing for an interview, it's having adequate clothing to wear to the interview. People can contribute in ways big and small. And I think that the impact that we can make is maybe more tangible when we pick a family and help them directly. There's a significant feeling of ungodly satisfaction from seeing somebody flourish from your very small efforts.
Mhm. I like that 'cause sometimes we focus on the really big efforts and those small efforts, which you saw from you sharing the beginning of your story was those small efforts that people in your community took to come alongside you can make a huge difference. Um, the last thing I'd love to hear your perspective about as we have new immigrants in the US or people who haven't been here for long, what would be one piece of advice that you would give them?
You have to go to school, you have to further your education, you have to learn the language. It is difficult. Um, my grandfather was 70 years old when he came, and he got fluent. And my grandmother, to her last day, was still learning English. My other grandmother, she, in order to pass the naturalization test, she memorized 100 questions and 100 answers. I don't necessarily know that she could tell you each and every one of them, but she learned them and she had them down pat and she was ready for her interview. Um, Language, number one. Two, you have to be prepared to just persevere because it takes a long, long time. Our story may sound like a miracle right now, right? We live across 3 states, we all have homes. I've put my kids through college, right? My older daughter is going to law school. It comes with a lot of long term effort um, and dedication and just grinding through things. So that has to be a part of one's journey. And then I think the third thing is you have to seek out the community. You have to seek out that support. In Russian, we say that the water doesn't come under a stone that's sitting in place. You have to move, right? You have to take accountability, ownership, proactive steps in bettering your situation, no matter how hard it is, knowing that there is a degree of safety net that will help you with your childcare, help you with translation, help you with getting to place if you don't have your own transportation. So those would be the three.
Thank you so much for your
Absolutely.
openness and vulnerability and sharing your story. I am a firm believer in when we share our stories, it can help people build empathy and kind of challenge the narratives that we believe. And so I'm really appreciative of your time today.
Absolutely.